First puzzle. Threats in this position are rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes knight check. Here are the checks. Queen to g1 check, queen to f1 check, queen to e1 check, queen takes knight check. The puzzle is solved using queen to e3, queen to a4, bishop to b4, queen takes bishop, rook takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. The checks are rook to h8 check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to h3, king to f8, queen to h6 check, knight to g7, queen to h8 check, knight to g8, rook to h6, queen to d8, rook to g6. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes bishop, rook takes pawn check, rook takes pawn. The checks are bishop to c7 check, queen to e5 check, queen to f4 check, queen to h6 check, queen to g3 check, queen to h3 check, queen to g1 check, rook takes pawn check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop to c7 check, rook to e5, queen to f4 check, king to h3, bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop check, rook takes queen. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are bishop takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to e1 check. The puzzle is solved using rook to e1 check, king to a2, bishop to g8, king to b3, rook to c1, bishop to c3, rook to h1, a4, rook takes pawn. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are c5 check. The puzzle is solved using f4, g4, h4, e5 check, pawn takes pawn check, king to e6, king to d3, king takes pawn, king to e3, king to d6, king to f4, king to e6, king to g5, king to e5, king takes pawn, king to e4, c5. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are bishop takes pawn, knight takes pawn check, queen takes knight check. Checks in this position are knight takes pawn check, knight to g6 check, queen to g7 check, queen takes knight check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to f1, c5, d5. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes rook check, rook takes pawn, king takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes rook check. The answer is rook takes rook check, king takes rook, king takes pawn, king to b6, king to h6. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using c4, pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, king to e3, king to c3. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn check, rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to c4 check, knight takes pawn check, knight to g5 check. Solution to the puzzle is knight to g5 check, king to e7, queen to h3, rook takes rook, queen to e6 check. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes knight, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, queen takes pawn check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn check. Answer to this puzzle is queen takes pawn check, king to h8, queen takes pawn, queen to g4, bishop takes knight. Another one. The threats are rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, knight takes knight, rook takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to h4 check, bishop to b4 check, rook to e2 check. The answer is Bishop to h4, check. King to f1. Knight takes knight. Rook takes rook. Knight takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. King to h2. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Bishop to g5. Queen to e1. Bishop to f4, check. King to g1. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are. Promotes to knight, check. The answer is. g5. Queen to h8. King to g4. Queen to a8. Knight to h6. One more, threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to g5, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to g5, check. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes queen. King takes pawn. b6. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. b4. One more, the threats are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to g6, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn. b5. Bishop to e6. Bishop to c8. Bishop to d5. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to g2, check. Queen to h1, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to f6. Rook to e3. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to h3. Knight to g4, check. King to g3. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to f3, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen to e5, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to g4, check. Knight to f5, check. Knight to h5, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Knight to h5, check. King to h8. Knight to f6. Queen to d4. Queen to h4. Queen takes knight. Rook takes queen. Another puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is. King to b5. King to b8. King to b6. Bishop to d7. Bishop to g4. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Bishop to h6. f5, check. Pawn takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Here are the checks. Rook to c1, check. Queen to e1, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to c1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. f6. Queen takes pawn. Rook to e8. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Knight to c3. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Rook takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to h4, check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen takes queen. Rook takes knight, check. King to f8. King to g6. Queen to c2, check. Rook to f5. Queen takes pawn, check. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: Queen takes knight check. Queen to e7 check. Queen to f7 check. Queen to g8 check. Queen to f6 check. Queen takes pawn check. Queen to e5 check. Rook takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn check. King takes rook. Queen to f7 check. King to h6. f4. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes rook check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to b8 check. Queen takes rook check. The puzzle is solved using rook to d3, h6, knight to d8, queen to h1, knight takes rook check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are rook to a7 check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes bishop, rook to f4 check, king to e1, king takes rook, a7. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to g3, g5, h4. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.